Welcome back to another episode of Heavy Metal Horror Show. We're really excited about what we just got finished filming.
Yeah, this is our first ever interview episode. John Kozik, owner, curator, and historian of the Salem Witch Board Museum, offered some of his time to us, and we learned a lot. We had a really good time talking with him. We talked about horror movies, we talked about witch boards, and we talked about music, all the things that we love here on Heavy Metal Horror Show. I think you'll enjoy this episode. Check it out.
Yeah, stick around. Let us know what you think.
That was the coolest thing in Salem, your museum.
Oh, thank you.
It was amazing. So
Yeah, we can't get together and do any of this without hearing about the Witchboard
yeah.
Museum.
Well, it's kind of evolving in America just post-Civil War at that point, but the Civil War really had such an impact on everyone being affected by death that everyone was trying a different way to try to communicate to the dead. And people had, claimed they could hear spirits knocking responses back to them, and conversations, from yes and no questions to counting knocks to figure out what letter of the alphabet they were on really took a long time. So a simple alphabet board was just introduced where people would, ask a spirit its name and they would point to each letter waiting for a knock from the spirit. And then the second device is called an automatic writing planchette, which looks very similar to what you see with a Ouija board today, except it would have a pencil at the front and wheels in the back. And it worked by just a medium channeling a spirit through themselves and then writing or drawing on a piece of paper, whatever came through. So those two devices kind of cross paths, and that's really how we get a talking board. So they're homemade and evolving at different speeds in the country, all the way up until mid 1880s is really when we start to see newspaper articles about these devices being used together. And we see a headline from Akron, Ohio, 1886, calling it a devil board. So they're kind of homemade all the way up until 1890. And the first mass-produced board is what becomes Ouija originally.
Wow. Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask you, because there's different pronunciations. Around here we hear Ouija a lot.
Sure.
And sometimes we hear Ouija. And I was just curious.
So the brand itself is Ouija, and that came about in 1890 when a woman named Helen Peters asked the unnamed board, just called a Witchboard at the time, what it wanted to be called. And it spelled back Ouija. She asked, what does it mean? And it spelled back good luck. When people say Ouija, they're not wrong. What happens is when you ask someone if they would use the board, you would ask them if they Ouija on it. So Ouija is the verb, Ouija is the noun. And that's where probably most of it comes from. I also speculate that other manufacturers couldn't compete against Ouija, so they ended up making their own boards, sometimes stealing the trademarked brand name, and sometimes trying to spell it differently and spell it Ouija, but that actually would infringe on the trademark. But there are boards that say Ouija on them, WHEEGE, but that's an infringement on the trademark, and that might have caused some confusion to some people as well.
How do you think that the Ouija board shaped the horror movie genre in general?
Oh, yeah.
Because I know that there are several movies, including Witchboard, but how do you think that it impacted the genre of horror movies in general?
It's huge. I mean, right from the very beginning, the first talking horror movie called The Terror from 1928, it has a Ouija board scene in the movie. So today there's well over 500 horror movies that have put the Ouija board in it. We actually have a catalog of all the TV shows and movies that it's been in. And, it starts off pretty campy, not necessarily something that's like feared or evil. It's just maybe giving bad news, but I don't think the board itself is really being feared. Um, but it escalates and it goes further up, from the uninvited in the 1940s, where they're using a homemade board with a wine glass as the planchette, where it goes flying across the room. 13 Ghosts in 1960. The Ouija board scene's pretty awesome in that, where the planchette levitates over the board and crashes into the wall. And that's where it's getting darker by that point. And then by the 70s, The Exorcist is really the movie that changed a lot of people's views towards the board. The superstitions that people think of today, like don't use the Ouija alone or always say goodbye on the Ouija board, they start from that movie in particular. So horror movies definitely influence people, and it goes hand in hand because the newest Ouija board that you'll find on the shelf, the last rule for that little travel-sized Five Below board, the last rule says always say goodbye. But that was not on these boards, pre-Exorcist. So clearly the movies influence people as to what they believe for sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow. We were talking about the rules for the for the Ouija board earlier, and I know in the movie Witchboard, Tawny Katan, she actually got messed up because she did it by herself because she
Yes.
fell into what's called progressive entrapment.
Yeah.
Is that a real phenomenon with Ouija boards when someone would use it alone, or where did that come from?
Well, Kevin Tenney was the writer and director of the movie, and he basically used a lot of different sources before he wrote it. And I think progressive entrapment really plays off of The Exorcist, number one, because now you've opened a portal. You've invited something in, and you have to close the board properly or something like that. So I think his version of progressive entrapment kind of evolves from true stories that happened around murder stories that happened around Ouija, as well as the movies themselves. But yeah, he was the guy that first started using that word progressive entrapment, which is pretty awesome.
Okay. Yeah, that is a really cool, it sounds so official. Progressive entrapment, It's
I know
cool.
it does, especially the way that Miles says it in the movie. I'm not Miles. That just the way he says it, he's perfectly played. The character in Witchboard, and know it all about the spirits and the board is played very well by there. But I think rules early on the Ouija board. The rules are pretty much trying to get people to date. It's at that time there's no people using it in a dim lit room. It was a guise to get men and women together. The rules say that it's best played between a man and a woman, best played with the board on your lap. So that's really how it was for a lot of people underlying. It's not overtly obvious, but it was a dating game in that way. And then eventually evolves over time. Like I said, today you'll see always say goodbye on the board. The other ones, like never use it alone or never use it in a graveyard, I would call them more urban legends and myths than rules. But all that stuff plays into it. It doesn't matter. You might consider, something a rule and you don't believe that same thing. But when you're using the Ouija board, those things influence how it works for some people. So two different people, two different beliefs, the board would work differently,
Wow. Yeah, it makes sense. So, you're the owner, the curator, and also an historian, when it comes to, Ouija boards, witch boards. What initially got you into Ouija boards? What was the fascination, and at what age did you start to really begin to get into it?
The real big catalyst was inheriting my grandmother's Ouija. She passed away in the late 1990s. And at that point I was late 20s at the time. And, but she had a very classic looking Ouija board with the couples in the corners. And, I think what a lot of people kind of think of when they think of Ouija, but I was lucky enough to be able to go online to try to learn more about it. But really, I saw that there was, hundreds of other competing manufacturers making these boards. And so that's really what made me start collecting them. And, I collected for about 6 years before I finally met another collector. I had run ads on Craigslist looking for boards. And I finally met a guy named Calvin in Connecticut, and he was the first collector. And then shortly afterwards, I met my friend Robert Murch, and then the hardcore collectors, we kind of started a group called the Talking Board Historical Society. We're a registered nonprofit who research, preserve, and celebrate the history of these boards. And so that's really how it started for me, was inheriting my grandmother's board.
That's about the time I had messed with one when I was probably early, I guess like mid-teens in the late '90s, and a friend of mine, ended up with one some kind of way, and we all got together at his house and started messing with it, and it was interesting. It was cool, and I was kind of it freaked me out a little bit, because I had asked it a question that like only I knew the answer to, I asked it my great grandmother's name and it spelled it out. And,
wow.
I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it now.
Yeah.
But, I was always like, did I subconsciously make that happen, or is that a real deal? But I don't know. It was just an awesome experience for me.
Yeah.
Was it a one and done? Have you used the board since then, or was that pretty much the last time?
I think that was the last time. I can't think of another time that I fooled with one.
Wow.
But I just never did have one.
Yeah.
Had the opportunity again, I guess, to mess with one.
All right. I get people who come to the museum to tell me Ouija stories, and a pretty large percentage are using it one time and then wanting to touch it again. And to me, I'm always like, well, your story, it worked. And so that's great confirmation you were looking for. But with the Ouija board, it's one of those things where if it works, then you almost don't want to use it again,
Yep.
Wow.
Oh, yeah. Especially after watching some of those movies, because then you're like, all right, so what is the right process? Am I leaving some weird portal loop?
Right. You don't want to do it wrong.
I mean, I can tell you that, the superstition, always say goodbye, came from The Exorcist. Doesn't matter. If you still believe you're supposed to, it's good manners and you want to do it, of course you should do it. Because if you believe it and then you forget, whatever the first bad thing that happens to you, as little as a splinter or something like that, you're going to probably blame the Ouija board. So, it's all your peace of mind. So what you're comfortable doing, that's kind of that's what I consider the rules to be, is your gut instinct.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I love that take.
Yeah, I like that take too. When did the actual idea of the museum, start in your mind, and when did that kind of happen, start to materialize?
It was a pretty long process. I think every collector wants to eventually be able to put their stuff out on display, and I think the two major things that happened to me were, one, the TBHS was trying to raise money to put in a headstone for Helen Peters, who had named the board, buried in an unmarked grave. And so I worked out a deal with the Satanic Temple in Salem to do a lecture and a gallery. And my friend Calvin came up and lectured with me one night. And then I curated their space with Ouija boards. And at the end of the month, they were so happy with the turnout, they asked if they could keep it up another month. And then third month, they kept it up. So to me, that was a big eye-opener to be like, wait, this isn't just me and my weird friends. There are other people that are interested in this as well. So always wanting to do a museum seemed less of a risk, knowing that people wanted to see it. I knew that I had to do something in Salem because the Ouija board was made there. It's got local history, and it's got year-round tourism. You can't just go and put a Ouija museum in, Oklahoma or someplace like that. It's just not going to happen. So Salem is already built for that, and it had local history. But the second major thing was there was a museum in California, out in LA, called the Mystic Museum, and they're awesome. I really highly suggest anyone listening, if they're in LA, go to it. It always has really cool exhibits, especially with horror. A couple years back, they did Slashback Video, an 80s VHS rental store, all time capsule, big boxes, clam boxes of horror, all the posters, everything was great. They've worked with like Eli Roth and done, exhibits with his stuff, and Church of Satan. So it's an amazing museum. But when they first opened, I went there, and I'd known the owners for a couple of years. I had sold them a few boards over the years. But the first time I went, the person at the register was like, oh, do you want to pay, $5 and you can go look at their personal collection? And I was like, yeah. So I paid the money. I went to the back room, It was self-guided. There was no one back there. And I was staring at like 3 or 4 Ouija boards. I had sold them over the years. And I thought, well, I have way better, cooler, rarer, interesting boards than these. And here I am. I just paid money to look at these boards. And so that changed how a museum was going to be for me, because it went from risking a storefront, insurance, employees, all these different things, to if I could find space in the back of a store and just kind of have some infrastructure there, it would be less of a risk financially. And so, finding the space I did in Salem was just that, the back room of a Harry Potter store, and originally I worked my day job. So I didn't, I would just go there after work, but it was self-guided for those first few hours. But over time, I want to be there more, and people wanted me there more. And so I eventually left my job of 22 years. So that's all I do is just work at the Ouija Museum.
Wow.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
To be able to do something that you love to do and get paid.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's awesome.
Yeah, I'm very fortunate. If I'm in a bad mood, I don't want to take a day off. I don't enjoy days off. I'd rather go to the museum, and even if I meet only a handful of people in the winter, a slow day, to me, it's the greatest thing. People want to hear about Ouija boards, and I'm excited to talk to them about it.
Yeah. Wow. That's awesome.
That's incredible.
That's the life right there,
Yeah. That's the goal.
Yeah. It's something that you can't predict. 20 years ago, I would never have been like, that wasn't something I aimed to do. It just fell into place.
Wow, that's really awesome. What's the oldest Ouija board you've ever had your hands on?
Well, the oldest one in the museum is from 1890, and it's right before they named it Ouija. It was mass produced by Charles Kennard when he had the idea for it, but he didn't have a name, and so we call it the Witchboard, and that's from 1890. My friend Calvin is in possession of what's known as the oldest known talking board, and we date it to around 1886. We actually have he has the family's Bible with information about it and stuff. So normally it would be kind of hard to date a piece of wood, from 1880 to 1890 without any kind of advertising and things like that. But 1886 is the oldest board we have. My friend Calvin has that I've touched, and 1890 is the oldest one in the museum.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah. Wow.
Jeez. Has anything ever strange happened at the museum that you can't really explain?
Yeah, there's a lot of strange things that happen. Certainly people getting dizzy or passing out, getting sick, those are all pretty common things. But of course, that could be someone psyching themselves up. If they're nervous to be in a room full of Ouija boards, then they could have, caused it themselves. But the things that I can explain is, people have told me before I even moved in that there was paranormal activity there. And as I set the space up, probably 8 different people who really didn't know each other, peripherally they knew each other, but not well, they all came in and told me similar stories about the space being touched and pushed and scratched and things like that. And once you start hearing those stories, you're like, okay. And then now that I've been open, a few weird things have happened. One is one side of the room where the couch is, where a lot of people do photo sessions and stuff. That side is considered more active than the main room. And that side specifically sits behind the wand shop, which is next door. It's a shop where they make wands in the basement, like Harry Potter wands and stuff. And over the years, the guy who makes that, he has told stories of, being touched and pushed and things like that. So the side of the room that it's on tends to have more activity. But the unexplained things would be technology. A lot of stuff happens with, first of all, cameras with film that come back blurry, Polaroids where come back blurry, it develops, then it undevelops, you can't see it, photographs on your cell phone where certain boards that have been donated because the previous owners had a bad experience with them, they're pitch black on the screen, even though everywhere else on the wall you can see the item. They come back blurry, of course. I've had CNN came to film, the batteries in their cameras kept draining, they couldn't explain what happened, they made everything work properly. Same thing happened to CNN Australia that came to film. They'd asked me all the weird stuff. I told them, but there's cameras in the museum, and when I first opened, the camera that's in the more active side, first of all, it never shuts off. So it feels as though there's something in that. It's motion detective, and it feels as though there's something in that side of the room. It never shuts off. The other camera in the main room, a couple nights early on, it went off 2 nights in a row, and back then there were no lights in the cases. It was just an exit light in the far back of the room. And if you slow down the recording, you see like a shadow come up from behind a case and kind of lurch over the case. I don't have an explanation for those things because there's 3 a.m. in the museum with no lighting, no one there, no changing. Why is that happening? So I like that there's like these kind of weird things that happen. And of course, I want to rule out the obvious, if someone tells me they see an orb, I'm like, it could be a piece of dust, I want to go the skeptical side at first, but there are definitely things that happen. Just recently, I had a person, I tell them that certain pictures come out pitch black in the museum. You'll take 50 pictures and you'll have one picture that'll be at least one picture will be pitch black. That happens very often. I had someone recently come back from their vacation. They were in Salem for a week. They took over 600 pictures. They sent me every single picture from Salem. The only picture that was pitch black was one of the 50 or so they took in the museum. It could be a coincidence, don't get me wrong, but if I tell you that you get pitch black pictures in the museum and then you take 600 pictures in the city and the only one that comes back pitch black was in the museum, it's a hell of a coincidence,
Wow.
That's
awesome.
Yeah.
I'm never surprised, people tell me all sorts of stuff, and I love that it happens. I've heard some pretty wacky things. People coming in and telling me that they hear "get out" in their hearing aid, things like that, which I've had paranormal investigations where they've recorded EVPs and they've heard "get out" on it. Back in December, an employee that had been working there for about 3 months, he came up from the basement and he was asking the person at the counter, "Hey, were you talking to me? Were you yelling down to me?" No, not at all. It's like, I heard someone yell "get out." Now, he's a guy that has not been to the museum. He's been through the museum. He's never taken a tour from me or heard my stories. And here he is, oblivious to these stories, telling me that he hears "get out" in the basement. So, there's things like that do happen pretty regularly. And, just never surprised.
Yeah.
Huh. I definitely felt a vibe when I was there. And I'm not even necessarily like a super superstitious person, but I felt something when I was there. It was something was like different,
Yeah.
It was really cool. It was really cool.
Yeah. I've got to get over there and check that out.
You recently went to Edinburgh, right? What was that about?
I just got back. It was a trip that I've been wanting to do for a long time, and it's really difficult for me to take time off from the museum. I feel a lot of pressure to be there, and I like being there, but at certain times I'm like, geez, I haven't taken a vacation in a couple of years. I want to do something. So I've been to England a dozen times, but I've never been to Ireland or Scotland. And I was just inspired to be like, wait, this is great because, I don't speak another language. So I'm going somewhere where it's pretty easy to travel for me. I've been somewhat near there before, and there are cities that just look really cool and old and historical. And so Dublin, I was only there for about a day, really quick. I used it as a launching pad to get to Edinburgh because there's no direct flights from Boston to there. So flying Boston to Dublin, if I was going to have a layover, I'd rather it be in Dublin than New York City. So that's how I went to Dublin. But then Edinburgh, fucking such a cool city, man. Like, wow. We were there. 4 days is a long time for me to be in one place. I usually, my partner and I, we bang stuff out and then we're on to the next place. But we were busy every day. We did new stuff and cool museums. Like there's a museum of witchcraft and magic and witchcraft over there, who had a Ouija exhibit. I happened to catch someone who'd been to the museum, who lives there, who was having a seance when we were there with a Ouija board, and went to this cool like punk rock club, the Screaming Banshee, and caught like a punk rock contortionist, and then like a horror movie comedian, which was pretty amazing. And then we did like kitschy stuff. Like there was a ghost bus tour, a double decker bus, and those guys did such an amazing job of like being in character, and just telling you cool stories. Yeah, so Edinburgh is a really great city, and I definitely would highly suggest going, and I'll definitely want to go back. So the one thing I was surprised about is, over the years, people have told me in Salem that Edinburgh is the other big city where there was witch trials and they burned witches there, and there were it's similar to Salem in the sense that there was we went across like 5 or 6 witch shops that looked like they could have been in Salem, but they didn't play the witch history up very much. Like there was a small little plaque we found on the witch's well up on the mile, and when we did a bunch of the tours, they mentioned it, but they really focused more on like the Black Plague and stuff like that. And I was just a little surprised that there wasn't more about witches. The museum I went to, the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic, he did a fantastic job of having that witch history there, timelines talking about more recent times of people being, arrested for witchcraft and stuff that you wouldn't think of. Like, wait, in my lifetime, someone's been arrested for witchcraft, and so the museum was great for that. Yeah, I mean, well, it's $10 to get in, and if I'm there, which I'm almost always there, you're going to get a bunch of cool stories. You're going to get not just the history and kind of pulling back the veil, so to speak, of where this all comes from and everything. The backstories. I'll give you spooky stories. I'll give you murders and suicides around the Ouija board, and what I do is I like to cater it to the person. So I ask you if you have questions because I want to know where your mind is going. So I meet people who really just want to focus on the legal aspects, infringing on the patent or the trademark, and litigation about the Ouija board, or patent infringement, that kind of stuff. I mean, people that just want to talk about horror movies, and we can do that for quite a while. Um, so I mean, I try to cater it specifically to what I think you're most interested in, which I think is a little bit different in most museums. Most museums, it's all about taking the money, coming in, getting out. And from Salem Witch Board Museum, it's more we get to know each other a little bit, and there's no rush to go out in that sense. It's like, oh no, you want to stick around and hear a bunch more stories, and oh wait, someone from Minneapolis just came in. I want to hear what John's going to have to connect the Ouija board to there, and they'll stick around and listen to me talk about 4 or 5 different cities of stuff. So I think that's different. There is a board that can be used, so people do come in to use the Ouija board there, which there's always fun stories with that. And then I sell a lot of antique and vintage boards, and yeah, I do movie nights there. So there's a lot, I do other things in the space.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember when I went. You're the first person I actually heard speak to a few of the other guests in the museum, and I thought it was so cool. And this was before I knew you were the owner of the museum. I'm like, God, this guy knows so much about and it kind of like pulled me in.
Yeah, so, sounds like you might know a bit.
Yeah. So you could definitely expect that if you ever go, like to get some good stories and some good background on it. And I do like the fact that I didn't feel rushed to get out. Like I just felt like it was reasonably priced, and I really enjoyed everything in there, and I felt like I could just kind of hang out.
Yeah.
So it was awesome. Yeah.
And I think because it's not just the history that I like to talk about. I mean, it's the obsessiveness to collect. It's talking about what each item is and where it came from is just as cool of a story in a lot of cases as to why I curated it in the museum to begin with. So, I think I realize the Ouija board is letters and numbers on a board, and that's only going to entertain people for so long. They'll be like, okay, I've seen 20 of these so far. They all look pretty similar. So, you have to kind of like go further into that than just putting boards on display. You have to talk about the people behind it, what was in their mindset, the people that are using it, why are they using it, and all the experiences that they have doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had no idea that that people were using it as kind of like a dating service.
Yeah, I had no
So
idea about that.
I'd never heard that before.
That
That
is really
one's more
cool.
obscure. Usually when people
Yeah.
come like the second or third time to the museum and they've heard me tell a lot of stories, that's usually one that I'll be like, all right, well, you probably haven't heard this one before. And
Right.
I have some other references to it. We're being very PG right now, but it gets very adult. There's adult movies, pornos with the Ouija board in it, and it gets into the magazines from the 70s, the witchcraft magazines. I have a board called the Psychic Sex Board, which is where people they consulted it if they would have the lights on tonight or not, or if they'd swing with another couple, that kind of stuff. A board of just sexual positions. So it goes pretty down. It goes down that rabbit hole pretty far. And I always make a joke. I'm like, people come in to tell me they bought their first Ouija board at Spencer's, and I'm like, right. It was in the back of the store, right? Yeah. Behind the beaded curtain? Yeah. What was it on the shelf next door near? Oh, adult sex toys. So, at that one store, they sell the Ouija board right next to it. So sex and the Ouija board is a thing. And, I like it when people are very scared of the Ouija that want to be less scared of it. I'm happy to oblige. If you want to be more scared of it, sure. But if you actually want to use it, and I like to use that information they're like, wait a minute, why am I fearing this exactly?
Right? Wow,
Nice.
that's pretty cool. Well, you mentioned horror movies. You said that there were nearly 500 horror movies
Sure.
that have Ouija board in it. Now, if you were on an island and you had to pick 5 Ouija board movies that you had to, these are the only 5 Ouija board movies you'd be able to see for eternity. Do you have like a top 5?
I would have a top 5. Yeah, I mean, certainly Witchboard and Witchboard 2 would be my top 2. And Witchboard 2, I played it at the museum not too long ago, and to be honest with you,
Mhm.
it might have inched a little bit ahead of Witchboard a little bit. Have you guys seen 2 yet?
So strangely, I haven't seen Witchboard 2, but I want to see it.
Yeah.
Two. I won't give away too much, but it's got I like the cast, and I like that he had a little bit more money to play with. So he put in some like
Okay.
car stunts and stuff, and like missing the brake, brakes going out on the car, that kind of stuff, and it just adds to like the cheesiness of it. It's the early '90s, so it's not as cheesy as the '80s stuff. But so Witchboard 1 and 2 are definitely on my list. I really am a fan of Don't Panic, which was a Mexican horror movie that Joe Bob Briggs did an episode last drive-in a couple years back with it. It's great because it's from the 80s. It's very Satanic Panic-esque. And of course, it's made in Mexico, so the acting is like over the top, overacting a little bit. I love The Exorcist, of course. The Exorcist is something that you would, take very seriously, much more scary film. I think it still holds up. And then for a fifth one, I mean, I just watched Satan, which is the Turkish Exorcist, and that's horrible. And I mean that in the best way possible, that it's so bad. But I probably would pick something else like Veronica. I thought they did a really good job with that. That's a Spanish horror movie as well. They came out like 2018 or 19, and scary. I thought it was pretty scary, based on a true story.
Okay.
Nice. Yeah, we pen and Emma writes these down.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, because we're always looking for new material, to cover, because we mainly cover horror movies. So
I will tell you, stay clear of Ouija Shark 2. That's pretty bad.
Oh, that sounds amazing.
Ouija Shark 1 was a little better, which I like the tagline, gonna need a bigger board. But 2,
wow.
I played it. I was like, this is bad. It's horrible. At the end of the movie, people gave it a standing ovation. They really loved it, but I was not a fan of Ouija Shark 2.
Okay. It's got to be so bad it's good, right? Like kind of like Troll 2.
Yeah, Troll 2 is amazing. It's not anywhere close to Troll 2.
We did an episode on Troll 2.
Nice.
On our channel. Yeah, it's one of the best. It's just so awesome.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a classic for sure.
Yeah, it's a classic.
Yeah.
I think that kind of like one of the because we talk about that movie like almost every time we hang
Really?
out, and let's just do a show.
Yeah.
I think that kind of
But yeah, that's awesome to know, because I mean we could cover when like Veronica
yeah
in the future,
For
because
sure.
we're always looking for like we do mainstream stuff sometimes, but what we really love is like the more underground
Sure.
horror movies. Kind of bring those to the forefront.
Yeah,
in people's
there's a
minds.
couple of them. I mean, a lot of them are really bad. I'm not gonna, just because it has a Ouija board in it and I love it. I know that the average
Right.
person must be like, this is a bad movie, and I understand that, but I still have to
Right.
watch them because there's a Ouija board in it. I wanted to
Yeah.
watch a movie called The Gift from 1984 because I've seen the trailer and the Ouija board scene is so great. She's battling with it, screaming at the board, and why are you doing this? And but unfortunately, they never made it on DVD, and so the movie was pretty bad, and it didn't do very well. The director made another movie. It didn't do very well. He took the two movies and kind of combined them to one, kind of like Spookies, where it's like almost two different things going on. And he got Ernest Borgnine to be like tell a story in between, so he's telling these two different stories. And I thought it's called Merlin's Shop of Mystical Wonders. And I was like, oh, Ernest Borgnine's in it, and it's playing The Gift, which was a ripoff of The Monkey, Stephen King. I was like, oh, it's gonna be great. And we played it at our last movie night. The Ouija scene was the first scene, and I was like, oh, wow, they're starting off with this. Wow, okay. And then I realized they pan out. They had Ernest Borgnine and his grandson are watching it on a television. So the only thing they saved from Devil's Gift was that scene, making it look like someone's just watching it on TV. And then from there, it was pretty bad. There was like a couple little points that got better, but in general, it was really slow and just not as good as it's sort of like if you have a kid who's really afraid of horror movies, this might be like the movie that you like try to play for him to be just a little their first introduction to be a horror movie. It's not scary at all, but it's like it's very kid-esque. But that was the last movie night I did, and then I just picked up Schoolgirl Screamers, which got picked up by Troma, and that's an '80s film as well. So that's what I'm going to play at the end of this month. That's what I'm going to play for movie night. Yeah.
So you do one movie a month?
Yeah. The last Sunday of the month, I try to play a horror movie with a Ouija board in it. And so, certain movies are way better. So like, I didn't play Witchboard for like 2 years, and then finally I was like, okay, the people who've come 2 years ago, there's been new people and they haven't seen it. So I did rehash that one and 2 recently. Where a lot of the other ones I've only played them once, and I just keep moving on to something new, or something, something else.
Yeah, you got at least 500 to go through. So
right.
Yeah. Well, some of them like there's there's one that I was like, oh wow, this had a pretty big budget. Like it must be pretty good. And I have to screen some of these sometimes. When I don't screen them, I pay the price. Because I'm like, this is so bad. Like the people are gonna leave. Like, fuck. But long since dead. That's what it was. And it's so bad. I'm like, they had like a real budget behind it too. And I'm like, damn. So I don't mind if I like cheesy. Don't get me wrong. And if you're watching with a group of people, I want to go cheesy. I don't want to play Veronica, which is subtitled and very scary and serious. It's just not the right movie, not the right vibe for the group, So I do want to try to play something that's like a little goofy,
Yeah, make it fun.
Yeah, exactly.
That's cool. Is the museum open 7 days a week, or is it just like a weekday?
No, we only close on Thanksgiving and Christmas. Those are the only 2 days we are closed. Yeah, so typically for me, in the wintertime, I try to take, maybe a Tuesday, Wednesday off. But the last 3 years, July 4th to Thanksgiving, I don't take a day off. So July 4th is my last day off, and then straight through.
You're open until 5, 6?
Well, technically, I tell people 6 o'clock because that's when I want to leave. It's 6 o'clock. I'm like, I want to go home and have dinner. And so I try not to mislead people. but technically they can get in the museum till 8 o'clock. That's when the front shop closes. But after I leave, it would just be self-guided. So you can come to the museum after I'm when I'm not there. But I really try to steer people to coming in when I'm there, because I just know it'll be a better experience for everybody.
And if you're in Salem, you need to check out Salem Witch Board Museum. It is the coolest thing to do in Salem. Trust me. And if you get to talk to John, it's just a bonus. So.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. And everyone listening, make sure you go check out Witchboard and Witchboard 2, and let us know what you think of them.